Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment where we get to dig a little bit deeper into a topic that is tied to a recent message here at Sunny Slope. This Advent season, we've been looking at the Gospel of Luke and the way that Luke prepares us for the birth of Jesus. And he sets up a number of events prior to the birth of Jesus. He talks about a visit that the angel makes to Mary, for example. We looked at that just recently. Part of that text has to do with the announcement to Mary that she will give birth to a child, and of course her response is one of surprise because, as she says, I'm not married yet, and so that's obviously part of the doctrine that the church has held to for a very long time, the doctrine of the virgin birth, which is related to another bigger question, which is when we think about who Jesus is, and we try to make sense of him being both human and divine, how do those two pieces relate together? How are we to understand Jesus, both human and divine nature? And that might sound like a very theoretical, very abstract question, but in fact, there are at least a couple of really significant misunderstandings or even heresies or errors that the church has identified that are significant enough that to fall into any of these heresies or incorrect teachings is to put yourself outside the bounds of the historic Christian faith. And so what I want to do, we didn't have a lot of time to really dig into all the nuts and bolts of it on Sunday, but I want to actually just explore with you two of the main heresies or wrong understandings of the nature of Jesus, and then kind of point to what is the historic Orthodox understanding of the nature of Christ. One of these heresies, one of these wrong teachings, is something called Arianism. Arianism was named after, well, the person who promoted that idea first, and who that idea is thus associated with. That's a man called Arius. Arianism denies the divinity of Jesus. Arianism really says that Jesus was a created being, and so he was in this sense really no different from you or me. It's just that he was chosen by God, and after his birth, he was born as an ordinary human being, and then because he was chosen by God, he sort of climbed his way up to enjoying supernatural status. So he was a created being, but he became divine. So he starts off like any other ordinary human being, but he was chosen by God and set apart by God, and then he followed the mission that God had for him, and in doing so, he became divine. He achieved divinity. Now, this teaching tends to emphasize the humanity of Jesus. It tends to put a lot of focus on Jesus being a very, human, ordinary person, but he was able to do extraordinary things. And one of the ideas that might then flow out of that is sort of this: you can do this too. You too can, if you work hard and you try hard, you too will be able to achieve this divine nature. Modern day versions of Arianism typically include like Jehovah's Witnesses, who teach that, again, Jesus, they teach that Jesus provided salvation for everybody by his death on the cross, but they actually teach that Jesus was a created being. He's not eternal. Mormonism teaches something similar. One of the problems with this, is that, of course, Jesus himself frequently emphasized that he was, in fact, divine. When he, especially in John's Gospel, he refers to himself frequently. He will say things like, "Before Abraham was, I am." And I and the Father are one. Other Gospels contain similar references and similar sayings. And so Jesus does not seem to allow in his teaching, he does not allow for the idea that he was somehow just an ordinary human who worked his way up to divinity. The second main heresy is something called Docetism. And Docetism is taken from a Greek word, dokeo, which is a word that means to appear or to seem. So like something seems like it's another. Docetism teaches that Jesus indeed was divine, but he was not really human. He only appeared to be human. He only seemed to be human. In other words, Jesus was a spiritual being who came into this world, and he, in a lot of ways, he was like a ghost or an angel or something that only had the appearance of humanity. And so when a docetist looks at, for example, the virgin birth, they tend to say, well, he really wasn't born of a virgin. His suffering really wasn't real. It just had the appearance of suffering. Any of his human experiences being hungry or thirsty, he really wasn't those things. He just kind of appeared it. He was just kind of going through the motions, but it really wasn't an actual thing. You'd find this belief a lot in, say, Christian Science or New Age teachings that tend to emphasize that the material world is really an illusion, but it's really the spiritual realm that has meaning and that's real. Everything that in this world is actually just sort of an illusion. It's just something in our imagination. But what really counts and what's really true and real is the spiritual realm. Now, John, it seems that the early church faced the heresy of Docetism very early on. In fact, probably earlier than Arianism. Docetism was around in the time of the apostles, and so John, who was the latest of the apostles, in other words, John lived the longest, and so he was around to see the most kind of false and incorrect teachings creep into the church. John writes about this quite extensively. I'll just give you, John actually says in 2 John chapter 7, he says that anyone who denies that Jesus is God in the flesh is denying the essential truths of the gospel. So John has this in mind, has this false teaching in mind. So, and of course, there are other teachings that emphasize the humanity of Jesus, that Jesus really is God in the flesh. Now, those are the two main heresies: Arianism, Docetism. There are other sort of varieties or combinations of these teachings. Modalism teaches that Jesus was really God, but he was sort of God in the mode of the Son, and there's others that teach that Jesus was kind of his human nature and his divine nature kind of mixed together and created this whole new substance. So there's different versions of this, but they're all kind of variations on that same theme. So what is orthodoxy then? If those are heresies, what is the true understanding of, and the biblical understanding of how do we know who Jesus really is? Well, John Calvin, a Protestant reformer, he says that Jesus is and remained fully human, and he is and remained fully God. So the natures of Jesus, the divine and human nature, it's not like you kind of pour half a cup of divinity and half a cup of humanity and stir it all together. He says, no, the natures of Jesus, the divine and human nature, were not mixed together in that sense. They remained, so in other words, Jesus remained fully human and he remained fully God. And Calvin says that's understandably a little bit hard to imagine, but then he goes on to provide an analogy that's actually pretty helpful. He says, human beings, he says, all of us, we have both a body and a soul. And at no point do body and soul kind of mix together, and they're not commingled. We always have a body, we always have a soul. Those things are separate and they're distinct, but they're always united together. And Calvin says that's how we can think of what Jesus is like. He's always divine, he's always human, but those things are never mixed together. They're never, they're sort of never compromised. They're always distinct. They're always united together. Now, why does all of this matter? Why should we care how we think about Jesus? Well, there's a lot of reasons. I'm going to just give you one of them. It's important that Jesus is human because Jesus, in order to provide for our salvation, Jesus needs to be one of us. He needs to, as the Heidelberg Catechism says, man has sinned. Man must pay for their sin. In other words, it's human beings who have the problem of sin, and so you can't have another animal or another creature come in and take the blame. It has to be a human being. And so it's essential that Jesus is a full human being. So by becoming one of us, he actually identifies with us. A further benefit we gain from this, of course, is that we have a Savior who understands what we experience. He knows our weakness. He knows what it's like to be hungry and tired and thirsty. He knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows fully what we go through. So he is one of us. He represents us. He's fully human in that sense. But then, no human being, again, to use the words of the Heidelberg Catechism, no human being can bear the full weight of God's judgment against our sin. And so we need someone, we need a mediator who can also bear in himself the full weight of divine judgment against sin. That's the reason why then that Jesus must also be fully God. And so in the person of Jesus, we see the divine and the human united together, not commingled, not mixed together, but united and joined together as one, so that we have indeed a perfect mediator. We have one who can represent us, and we have one who can bear the punishment that we deserve, so that our sin might be taken away, we might be reconciled to God. That's what we celebrate at Christmas. That's one of the biggest reasons we have for giving thanks to God at Christmas. Properly speaking, we're not celebrating a birthday, we're celebrating the Incarnation. God coming to us, taking on human flesh, and coming to us that indeed we might have salvation. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time on the cutting room floor.